The night my wife's mother looked me dead in the eye and said, "You either apologize to this family or you leave." I did something none of them expected. I smiled. Not a big smile, just a small one. The kind that comes when you realize something has finally become simple. My name is Howard. I'm 51 years old. I spent 22 years as a structural engineer, built a career that paid for 3 houses, including the one we lived in, and the vacation property her parents used every summer without asking. I raised 2 kids who turned out decent. I coached Little League for 6 years even when my knees were bad. And for 9 years, I sat at the table with my wife Sylvia's family and absorbed every single thing they threw at me because I believed that's what a good husband does. I was wrong about that. Let me back up. I met Sylvia in the spring of 2001. She was finishing her MBA at Ohio State. I was 28 and already 2 years into my first serious job at a civil engineering firm in Columbus. We were set up by a mutual friend at a dinner that neither of us actually wanted to attend, and within 40 minutes, we were the only 2 people still at the table. We got married in 2003. Our son Eli was born in 2005. Our daughter Cora came in 2008. For the first few years, everything was fine. Her family was a little formal. Her father, George, was the kind of man who measured other men by what they drove and where they went to college, and her mother, Donna, ran the family the way a general runs a platoon. But they were cordial enough. George shook my hand. Donna complimented my cooking the one Thanksgiving I hosted. I thought we had an understanding. The understanding ended the year I turned 40. I'm not sure what changed, exactly. Maybe George retired and had more time to form opinions. Maybe Donna had always had those opinions and just stopped hiding them. Maybe it was the fact that my father-in-law had always assumed Sylvia would marry someone with a law degree or an MBA, and the idea of a structural engineer just never fully sat right with him. Whatever the cause, the tone shifted. It started small. Comments at the dinner table about news stories, always framed in a way that somehow circled back to people like me. People who worked with their hands. People who weren't in finance or law. People who couldn't talk about quarterly earnings at a birthday party. George once said, in front of 6 people, that he found it hard to respect any man who spent his life calculating load limits instead of building something that matters. I asked him what he thought bridges were for. He didn't answer. Then came Sylvia's brother Scott. Scott was 38, worked in private equity in Charlotte, and wore the kind of confidence that comes from never being in a room where you weren't the most financially successful person present. He drove a Porsche Cayenne, which I know because he mentioned it approximately every 3rd time I saw him. He and his wife, Lindy, had a house in a gated community outside Charlotte that they referenced as the estate, without a trace of irony. The first time Scott really went at me, we were at George and Donna's house in Hilton Head for the 4th of July. We'd been sitting on the back porch, watching fireworks over the water, and somehow the conversation turned to the infrastructure bill that had just passed in Congress. I mentioned that it was good news for my industry, that there was a lot of bridge and road work coming down the pipeline. And Scott laughed, not a polite laugh, a laugh that said, "Oh, that's cute." Bridge inspectors, he said, like he was naming a species. I forget that's actually a job. I'm a structural engineer, not a bridge inspector. I told him so. He waved his hand like the distinction wasn't worth making. Lindy looked at her phone. Sylvia, sitting 2 feet away from me, said nothing. That was the first time I really noticed it. The silence. Not just Scott being Scott. I could handle Scott. But Sylvia just sitting there, nodding slightly at whatever her father said next, moving the conversation along like I hadn't just been dismissed in front of 7 people. I brought it up on the drive home. She said Scott was just being Scott, that her family was blunt, that I needed to not take everything so personally. I didn't push it. Over the next few years, I got very good at not pushing it. There were comments about how I dressed at family events. Too casual, apparently, though no one had told me the dress code was cocktail party at a backyard barbecue. There was the Christmas where George spent 40 minutes explaining to me why union labor was destroying the country, looking me directly in the eyes the whole time, knowing full well my firm worked with union contractors. There was the Easter, where Donna, while serving ham, mentioned that Lindy had really elevated their family because of her connections in Charlotte's social scene, and looked at me when she said it. And every single time, Sylvia was somewhere else in the room, laughing at something, or she was right there and just didn't say a word. The one time I asked her directly, sat down at the kitchen table and said, "Sylvia, why don't you ever say something when your family does this?" She cried. And somehow, by the end of the conversation, I was the one apologizing. I don't fully understand how that happened. I just know it did, and I let it. And then I told myself things would be different at the next family gathering. They never were. By the time we hit year 7 of this, I had developed a whole system. I'd arrive at family events having already lowered my expectations to 0. I'd bring a bottle of good wine, because it gave me something to do with my hands. I'd find one person in the group who was halfway decent, usually Sylvia's cousin Faye, who lived in Portland and seemed as baffled by the family dynamics as I was, and I'd station myself near her for the evening. I'd smile and nod and answer questions politely and count the hours until we could leave. It wasn't a marriage anymore. It was a performance. The birthday party was in October. George was turning 72. Donna had rented out a private room at a seafood restaurant in Hilton Head, the same town where we'd spent every major family gathering for 15 years, because Donna liked it and what Donna liked became tradition. There were about 30 people there. Family, a few of George's old golf buddies, some neighbors from their retirement community. I wore a navy blazer. I had my hair cut the day before. I brought a framed photograph from a trip George and I had taken the year after the wedding, just the two of us, deep sea fishing off the coast of Georgia, because I genuinely thought he might like it. I was still doing things like that. Even then, the evening started fine. People were pleasant. George shook my hand and said, "Howard," in the way he always said my name, which was less like a greeting and more like an acknowledgement that I had arrived. Donna hugged me with about 30% of herself. Eli and Cora were there with their partners, and seeing my kids looking happy was enough to get me through most evenings. Then dinner started. I was seated between Sylvia and George's friend Ted, who was a retired federal judge and, honestly, a perfectly nice man. Across from me was Scott, and next to Scott was a younger guy named Chase, who was Scott's new business partner, mid-30s, freshly sharp in the way that people are when they've just made their first real money and haven't been humbled yet. The conversation was normal for about 40 minutes. Then George's golf group started talking about a development project near their community. Some kind of mixed-use thing going up on the marshes, and one of them mentioned that the foundation work had been delayed because of soil conditions. I said something about expansive clay soils, how they're common along the coast, how you have to account for the moisture content in the load calculations, or you'll get settlement problems that don't show up for years. Chase looked at me across the table. "That's what engineers do? Calculate dirt?" He wasn't being hostile exactly. He was being the kind of casually dismissive that people are when they don't realize they're being dismissive, when it just doesn't occur to them that what you do might be worth taking seriously. "Among other things," I said. "No offense," he said, which is always what people say when they're about to offer offense, but doesn't software do most of that now? Like, can't you just plug numbers into a program? Scott laughed. "Chase, man, come on." But he was smiling when he said it. I looked at Sylvia. She was cutting her fish. "It's a little more complicated than that," I said, and I kept my voice even because I was 51 years old and I'd been keeping my voice even in rooms like this for 9 years. "I'm sure it is," Chase said, and went back to his conversation. Dinner ended. Dessert came. George blew out candles on a key lime pie, his favorite, and people sang and took photos. I stood at the edge of the group and smiled and clapped. And then, during the part of the evening when people were milling around with coffee, and the event felt like it was winding down, Donna appeared beside me. She didn't ease into it. She said, "Howard, I need to talk to you." We stepped to a quieter corner of the room. She stood very straight, the way she always did when she was about to say something she'd already decided could not be argued with. "Chase is a guest of this family," she said, "and I think what you said to him at dinner was rude." I stared at her. "What I said to him, you made him feel small. You were condescending." I genuinely could not locate the version of that dinner where I was the one who'd been condescending, but I knew this script. I'd heard it before in different forms. I took a breath. Donna. He told me software does my job. I just said it was more complicated than that. Your tone, she said. Your tone was dismissive. Donna, I'm going to need you to go over there and apologize to Chase and to Scott because you made his partner uncomfortable. She looked at me steadily. Or you should probably just head home for the evening. There it was. Head home for the evening. At my father-in-law's birthday party, that I had driven 4 hours to attend. I looked across the room. Sylvia was standing with her sister-in-law Lindy, laughing at something. She was maybe 20 feet away from me. She hadn't come over. She didn't know this conversation was happening. And this is the part I spent a long time sitting with afterward. Maybe she did know, and she'd decided that coming over wasn't worth the trouble. I stood there for a moment, and then something very quiet happened inside me. It wasn't anger. I want to be clear about that, because I know how these stories are supposed to go. The moment where the man finally snaps, raises his voice, makes a scene. That's not what happened. What happened was almost the opposite. It was like a door closing. Not slamming. Just closing softly, with a click. I looked at Donna. Let me think about that, I said. She nodded, satisfied, and walked away. I went to the restroom. I stood at the sink and ran cold water over my wrists, which is something I do when I need to think clearly. I looked at myself in the mirror for about 30 seconds. Then I took out my phone. I texted Eli, "Hey, I'm heading out. Tell your grandfather happy birthday from me. Love you." Eli texted back almost immediately. "Everything okay?" I typed, "Yes. Take care of your sister tonight. I'll explain later." Then I walked out of the restaurant. Not through the private dining room where everyone was. Through the front entrance. I gave a nod to the hostess, who looked a little startled. I walked to the parking lot, got in my car, and I sat there for about 10 minutes without turning the ignition. I wasn't dramatic about it. I just sat. I thought about the photograph I'd brought for George. I'd left it at the table. I wondered if anyone would notice it, or if it would end up in a bus tub with the dessert plates. Then I thought about something else. I thought about our house. Our house was in Westerville, Ohio. The one I'd bought 2 years before Sylvia and I got married, that I'd carried the mortgage on alone for the first 4 years while she built her career, that we'd refinanced twice, and eventually paid down to the point where we had real equity. The house where Eli had learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where Cora had done her homework at the kitchen table for 11 years, where I had spent 22 years of my life building. Something I thought was shared. I thought about the vacation property in Asheville that we'd bought in 2017 that had been Sylvia's idea, and I'd said yes because I thought it would be good for us, give us a place to decompress, and instead it had become the de facto extension of the Hilton Head gatherings, a second venue for the same dynamic. I thought about how many times I had said yes when I should have said something different. I turned the car on and drove to the hotel where we were staying. Sylvia and I had separate keys. I packed my bag. I was neat about it. I didn't want to leave a mess. I took my toiletries, my laptop, my charger. I left her shampoo and her book and her reading glasses on the nightstand, exactly where she'd put them. I drove home to Westerville. 8 hours. I stopped once for gas and a coffee outside of Columbia, South Carolina. I was in my driveway by 5:40 in the morning. I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen and drank another cup of coffee and waited for the sun to come up. When it did, I called my brother-in-law. Not Scott, but my own brother Raymond, who lived in Cincinnati and was the only person I trusted to be completely straight with me. I told him everything. Not dramatically, just the facts, in order. When I was done, Raymond was quiet for a moment and then said, "Howard, what took you so long?" I didn't have a good answer for that. By the time Sylvia called, it was almost 9 in the morning. I'd been awake for 30 hours. "Where are you?" she said, not angry, more confused, like she'd woken up to find the furniture rearranged. "Home," I said. "You just left without telling me?" I texted Eli. Silence. Then Howard, "What is going on? My mother Chase is upset. Scott thinks you." "Sylvia," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer it." She waited. "In 9 years, has your mother ever spoken to you the way she speaks to me?" Silence. "Has your brother ever said anything to you the way he talks to me?" More silence. When's the last time someone in your family made you feel like what you do doesn't matter, like who you are isn't quite enough, and you just sat there and said nothing? I heard her breathing. That's what I thought, I said. I'm going to take a few days. I think you should take some time too. I hung up. I want to be honest about the next part, because I've heard people tell stories like this and make it sound like everything clicked into place immediately, like there was a clean montage of self-discovery, and by the end of the week, they had abs and a new apartment and a life coach. That's not what happened. What happened was that I spent 3 days mostly alone in my house, and it was uncomfortable. The house was very quiet. I ordered Thai food the first night and couldn't finish it. I watched a documentary about the construction of the Hoover Dam, which is the kind of thing I find genuinely interesting, and which I'd never been able to watch without someone in the other room wanting to put on something else. I called Cora and had a long conversation I'd needed to have for years. She cried a little. I tried not to. On the fourth day, I called a family law attorney in Columbus. Her name was Patricia. She came recommended by a colleague, and she was direct in the way that good attorneys are direct. Not brutal, but clear. She explained what the process looked like, what the timeline typically was, what I needed to document, what I needed to stop doing. Don't move out of the marital home, she told me. You're already there. Stay. I stayed. I also called my financial advisor, a man named Ed, who'd been managing my accounts for 14 years and who had the kind of calm that you want in a person who knows exactly what your net worth is. I had individual retirement accounts, a 401a, through the firm, a taxable brokerage account I'd opened in 2012, and equity in 2 properties. Some of that was marital. Some of it had been mine before the marriage. Ed walked me through what was what, clearly, carefully. I didn't do anything dramatic. I didn't move money around, or close accounts, or do anything that could later be characterized as hiding assets. Patricia had been very clear on that point. I just needed to know where I stood. What was mine, what was ours, what the picture actually looked like. It was a clearer picture than I'd expected. Sylvia came home on the 5th day. She stood in the kitchen doorway with her overnight bag over her shoulder and looked at me in a way I recognized. It was the look that meant she'd decided on a strategy, that she'd talked to her mother, and probably to Lindy and maybe to Scott. And she had a plan. We should talk, she said. Okay, I said. What happened at the party? I'm not apologizing to Chase, I said. She stopped. I'm not apologizing to Scott, and I'm not apologizing to your mother. I kept my voice the same way I'd kept it in the restaurant, even, quiet, not cold, but not warm. Just real. That's not something I'm going to do. Howard, I want to be fair to you, Sylvia, because I think you're good percutates, and I think some of what happened between us was my fault, too. I let it go on too long. I kept showing up and expecting something different, and that's on me. I looked at her. But I think you know that something has changed, and I think we should figure out what that means for both of us. She sat down at the kitchen table. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then she said, Are you asking me for a divorce? I'm asking you to be honest with me about what this marriage actually is, I said. And if you can do that, if we can actually do that, then maybe there's something to work with. But if the answer is that things go back to the way they were, then yeah, I think that's where we're headed. She was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, My mother has always been like this. I know that. I never wanted to fight her on it. I know, I said. It wasn't fair to you. No, I said. It wasn't. We sat there in the kitchen for about an hour. It was the most honest conversation I'd had with Sylvia in probably 5 years. No strategy, no deflecting, no tears that became apologies that became my fault somehow. Just 2 people being straight with each other, which sounds like a low bar but felt, in that moment, like something significant. I don't know how it's going to turn out. I want to say that clearly, because I've heard too many stories that wrap up too neatly, and mine isn't like that yet. What I can tell you is that I'm still in my house. I'm still going to work. Eli calls me every Sunday. Cora texts me memes, which is how she shows affection, and it makes me laugh every time. I talked to Raymond last week. He asked how I was doing, and I had to think about it for a minute before I answered, which I think is itself an answer. I told him I felt like myself again. Like the Howard who showed up to that Ohio State dinner in 2001, not knowing anyone, with no strategy and no angle, just a guy who wanted to have a good conversation. That guy had been missing for a while. I'm glad he's back. The thing about spending 9 years absorbing something is that you don't always notice the weight of it until you put it down. And then one day you're sitting in a hotel parking lot in Hilton Head at 11 o'clock at night, and you feel something settle in your chest, and you realize you're not going back in there. You're just not. They gave me two options. I took a third one. I went home.